need to go on to Heather MacDonald, fellow at the Manhattan Institute, writer of The Diversity Delusion, and other the war against the police and other topics which all matter. She's a wonderful speaker. We're glad to have her here. I'd love to answer any further questions later, and I'm about to hand this microphone over to her. More literally.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me, and thank you, David, for producing this wonderful report. It's always an extraordinary honor to be associated with the National Association of Scholars, which saw the rot happening early on and has been manfully, and I guess I'm not allowed to say that, excuse me, fighting in the trenches to bring us back to sanity. The last time I was in the Raleigh-Durham area, I was at Duke Law School. So you can imagine what that was like. I was there to proclaim that the campus rape epidemic does not exist. That didn't go over well with the students. That protest consisted of students walking through the hall with their cell phones, filming people in the audience in order to try to blacklist anybody who dared show up. So if you guys stay in your seats, I'm going to be quite surprised and gratified. It'll be a novel experience. In response to this admirable effort at optimism, I'm afraid I'm going to have to echo David and say that, in fact, I'm here as the bearer of bad news. I think we are in an emergency. The social justice movement on campuses, so thoroughly documented by the NAS and David, is a symptom of an even greater perversion of academic values, the cult of race and gender victimology, otherwise known as diversity. We've heard a little bit about that today. I'm going to argue that the diversity cult is destroying the very foundations of our civilization. But first, let's explore why social justice education is an oxymoron. Why shouldn't an academic aspire to correcting perceived social ills? After all, isn't knowledge supposed to help society progress? The 19th century American land-grant universities and the European research universities were founded on just that premise. But social justice is a different beast entirely. When a university pursues social justice, it puts aside its conventional claim to authority, the disinterested search for knowledge. We accord universities enormous privileges. Their denizens are sheltered from the hurly-burly of the marketplace on the assumption that they will pursue truth wherever it will take them, unaffected by political or economic pressures. The definition of social justice, however, is deeply political, entailing a large number of contestable claims about the causes of socioeconomic inequality. Social justice proponents believe that those claims are settled, and woe to anyone who challenges them on a college campus. There are, however, alternative explanations besides oppression and illegitimate power for ongoing inequalities, however taboo those explanations may be in academia. A social justice agenda, therefore, is a political commitment, and politics is not disinterested, it is tribal. Such tribalism inevitably caricatures political opponents and whitewashes political leaders, ignoring facts along the way, as shown by both the frenzied hostility to Donald Trump on the left and by his elevation to status of wise statesman and paragon of truth-telling by his most enthusiastic supporters, including in the conservative intelligentsia. Max Weber criticized the conflation of intellectual work with political action in his great 1918 lecture, Science as Vocation. Quote, "Whenever the man of science introduces his personal value judgment, a full understanding of the facts ceases." End quote. The primary task of a teacher, Weber said, is to teach his students to recognize what Weber called inconvenient facts, facts that are inconvenient to students' party opinions. And for every party opinion, Weber said, there are facts that are extremely inconvenient. Our political understanding of the world is partial. We will emphasize certain aspects of reality that buttress our values and de-emphasize other aspects that contradict those values. When an academic pronounces on how one should act, he becomes a prophet or a demagogue, Weber said, neither of whom belong on the academic platform. Weber adduced one other reason for abjuring politics in the classroom. Amusingly, an adverb that does not usually modify the great sociologist, it has been rendered completely irrelevant by 20th century education trends. A professor should not inflict his politics on his students, Weber said, because those students may not challenge his authority. Quote, "It is somewhat too convenient to demonstrate one's courage in taking a stand where the audience and possible opponents are condemned to silence." To which one can only respond, if only. We will leave aside such student abuse of the adults in charge as the scourging of Nicholas Christakis at Yale, of Brett Weinstein at Evergreen State College, and of Allison Stanger at Middlebury College, among others. The goal of the ordinary classroom today is to get ignorant students babbling about whatever idle thoughts pass through their heads without showing any intellectual deference to their professor. The number of professors who deserve such deference, however, is by now depressingly low, thanks to the triumph of social justice ideology. Of course, many people on college campuses today are still, quote, condemned to silence. But they are silenced not out of any respect for faculty authority, but because they disagree with the premises of victim politics. Conservative Harvard Law students, a professor there recently told me, refrain from challenging the regnant dogmas in class, terrified that their remarks may end up on social media and thus jeopardize their careers. This unwillingness to air inconvenient facts, facts such as the connection between family breakdown and poverty, is precisely the shrinking of intellectual freedom that Weber warned against. And if a Harvard Law student, occupying the closest position to riches, power, and prestige that a university can guarantee, nevertheless feels acutely vulnerable in his dissent from the orthodoxies, what is a lowly undergraduate or even a postdoc to do? How bad is academic politicization? It is overt and unapologetic, as the NAS reveals. At a recent law school seminar on race and the law, the teacher proudly announced at the beginning of the class section, "We are training social warriors here." Now, had the professor said, "We are training justice warriors here," there would have been no problem. Justice warriors seek to realize one of the great aspirations of Western history, to be ruled by neutral principles rather than tribal partisanship. In the courtroom, justice warriors pursue this rule of law through the adversarial process, in which both sides are given an equal opportunity to advance facts and arguments in their defense. Social justice, however, is opposed to procedural justice. In a year of ever more strident victim rhetoric, one of the most disturbing auguries for the future was the protests at the Harvard and Yale law schools against the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Hundreds of students from our most prestigious and influential legal academies marched under the Me Too rallying cry, "Believe survivors," meaning any self-professed victim of sexual assault is entitled to automatic belief before any evidence is presented and sifted by a neutral tribunal. A disproportionate number of these elite law students will end up as federal judges, including on the Supreme Court. If they carry their believe survivors' commitment to the bench, due process is doomed. Many criminal law professors have given up teaching rape law, since female students claim to be traumatized by the very thought of a criminal defense in a rape case. Moot court has been similarly constrained. Many law students are no longer willing to take on the role of advocate for even an imaginary politically incorrect defendant. Harvard's Dean of Students, fired Harvard Law professor Ronald Sullivan from his job as an undergraduate dorm headmaster this year because of Sullivan's legal representation of accused sexual assailant Harvey Weinstein. Students and administrators alike deemed this representation an existential threat to the safety of female students in Sullivan's dorm. We will pass over in silence the maudlin theatrics of such a claim. Its substance is a triumph for social justice, but it is a dagger in the heart of justice. For Harvard's dean to declare that representing a politically unpopular client renders someone unfit to supervise students betrays Harvard's educational mission, which should be to teach students the preciousness of such cultural legacies as the presumption of innocence. The one overwhelming reality driving social justice pedagogy and the social justice crusade more generally is the seemingly intractable achievement gap between whites and Asians on the one hand and blacks and Hispanics on the other. Radical feminism, as well as gay and now trans advocacy, are also deeply intertwined with social justice thinking on campus and off, as we have just seen. But race is the main driver. Liberal whites are terrified that the achievement and behavior gaps will never close, and so they have crafted a totalizing narrative about the racism that allegedly holds back black achievement. The aforementioned race in the law professor, after announcing the class's social justice commitments, added, "We engage in race talk here." Boy, do they ever. Quote, "We talk about white fragility. What is the purpose of white fragility? What does it mean to live in a white culture with white norms and a white power structure? What does it mean that we are in a culture dominated by white folks?" the professor explained. A more pertinent question would be, what does any of this have to do with legal training? Living in a culture dominated by white folks simply means that if you are not white, you are in a minority, which is no different than what my status would be if I lived in Uganda. If being in a racial minority in a majority white country is so inimical to one's flourishing, plenty of places exist where a person of color would be in the racial majority. Non-whites the world over are beating down the doors to get into Western countries, however, with no comparable corresponding traffic moving in the other direction. The very politicians and academics who in the morning denounce America's lethal white supremacy, in the afternoon demand that the country open its borders to every intending third world immigrant with no penalty for illegal entry. These two positions are contradictory. The U.S. cannot be at the same time the graveyard for people of color and an essential beacon of freedom and life-preserving haven from oppression for people of color. So what are these white norms and white culture that race talk seeks to deconstruct? Objectivity, a strong work ethic, individualism, a respect for the written word, perfectionism, and promptness for starters, according to diversity trainers and many humanities, social sciences, and yes, as we've heard, even STEM faculty. Any act of self-discipline or deferred gratification that contributes to individual and generational success is now simply deemed a manifestation of white supremacy. The New York Times recently singled out parents who had queued up several hours early to visit a sought-after public school in New York City. Why were white parents at the front of the line for the school tour? Sneered the Times headline. The article answered, their white privilege, not their dedication to their children's schooling. How can you tell when a norm is white and thus illegitimate? Well, if you believe the social justice warriors, if it has a disparate impact on blacks and Hispanics. And given the large academic and behavioral gaps, every colorblind standard of achievement will have a disparate impact. Sadly, the average black 12th grader reads at the level of the average white 8th grader. Math skills are similarly skewed. Truancy rates for black students are often 4 times as high as for white students. Inner city teachers, if they're being honest, will describe the barely controlled anarchy in their classrooms, anarchy exacerbated by the phony conceit that school discipline is racist. Given such disparities, it is absurd to attribute the absence of proportional representation in the STEM fields, say, to bias. And yet, STEM deans, faculty, and Silicon Valley tech firms claim that only implicit bias explains why 13% of engineering professors say are not black. The solution to this lack of proportional representation is not greater effort on the part of students, according to social justice and diversity proponents. It is watering down meritocratic standards. Professors are now taught about inclusive grading and how to assess writing without judging its quality, since such quality judgments maintain white language supremacy. It is impossible to overstate how fierce and sweeping the attack on meritocracy is. Every mainstream institution is either furiously revising its standards or is in the crosshairs for failing to do so. STEM professional organizations decry traditional means of testing knowledge. Diverse students should be able to get credit for participation in a group project or for putting together a presentation for their family and friends on a scientific concept, say these STEM professionals. Faculty hiring criteria are also in flux. Some people in this audience probably recall the push a decade or so ago to give credit towards tenure for editing an anthology. End runs around scholarship expectations have gotten more creative since then. At Bucknell University, a minority faculty member suggested that participation in an expletive-filled faculty listserv discussion denouncing University of Pennsylvania law professor Amy Wax should quote towards the, quote, intellectual labor of faculty of color and be included in the faculty merit review. The most sweeping solution to the lack of racial diversity on the faculty is to get rid of departmental gatekeepers entirely, some of whom remain stubbornly wedded to traditional notions of accomplishment. The University of California at Davis has handed hiring decisions in several STEM fields over to a committee dominated by the university's head diversity official and other bureaucrats. These bureaucrats have no idea how to assess scientific research, but they are good at diversity bean counting. The social justice diversity bureaucracy has constructed a perpetual motion machine that guarantees it eternal life. Minority students who have been catapulted by racial preferences into schools for which they are not academically competitive inevitably struggle in their class. This is a burden that they don't deserve to bear. The cause of those struggles, according to the social justice diversity bureaucracy, is not academic mismatch, which is a real and cruel problem. It is the lack of a critical mass of other minority students and faculty to provide refuge from the school's overwhelming alleged bigotry. So the school admits more minority students to create such a critical mass. Rather than raising minority performance, however, this new influx of diverse students lowers it, since the school has had to dig deeper into the applicant pool. The academic struggles and alienation of minority students will understandably increase, along with the demand for more diversity bureaucrats, more segregated safe spaces, more victimology courses, more mental health resources, more diverse faculty, more lowered standards, and of course, more diversity student admits. And the cycle starts all over again. Because of the diversity imperative, medical schools will admit minority students with MCAT scores that would be automatically disqualifying if presented by a white or Asian student. Their academic performance is just what you would expect. Time to lower standards further. An oncology professor at an Ivy League medical school was berated by a supervisor for giving an exam in pharmacology that was too, quote, fact-based. Well, I don't know about you, but if I've got cancer, I want my doctor to know the facts about drug interactions. This same process of denorming is happening in law enforcement. Across the country, district attorneys are refusing to enforce misdemeanor laws, and judges are releasing convicted felons early because virtually every criminal justice practice has a disparate impact on blacks and Hispanics. That disparate impact is due not to criminal justice racism, but to exponentially higher crime rates. This ongoing push for decriminalization and de-incarceration will result in more black lives being lost to violent street crime. The liberal elites don't give a damn, however, since those black victims are being killed overwhelmingly by other blacks, not by racist cops or white supremacists. The ultimate social justice solution to the skills and behavior gap is to remove the competition entirely. From the moment children enter school, they are berated for their white heteronormative patriarchal privilege if they fall outside a favored victim group. Any success they enjoy is not due to their own efforts, they are told. It is due to the unfair advantages that a system deliberately designed to handicap minorities showers upon them. Teachers are being advised to ignore white male students, since asking or answering questions in class is now another mark of white supremacy. The pariahs are getting the message. I recently learned of a mother in Connecticut who asked her son why he was not making more of an effort in college. Doing so, he answered, would be a function of white privilege. Now, obviously, such an answer can simply be an excuse for laziness. But the relentless attack on any achievement that is not proportionally distributed among different identity groups cannot help but dampen some students' willingness to compete. Journalist George Packer recently wrote a controversial article in The Atlantic agonizing over the racial justice crusade that has engulfed the New York City school system. Packer family politics are such that his fourth grade son, quote, sobbed inconsolably when Trump was elected president, and Packer sympathizes with the broad goals of the system's racial justice crusade. But even he worries about the school system's fanatical leveling of academic excellence in the name of racial equity. Packard's daughter proclaimed that she wishes she weren't white so as not to have slavery on her conscience. One way to atone for being white is to stop conforming to allegedly white norms of accomplishment. Some alpha males will continue striving anyway, and certainly when it comes to college, we are not seeing a reduction yet in admissions mania on the part of white elites. But I predict over time a subtle deflation of effort among those who have fully internalized social justice guilt. The only precedent for our current resentment-driven war on the West's magnificent achievements is the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and that didn't turn out too well. The Chinese Cultural Revolution was waged mostly by the less educated against the more educated, however. The oddest feature of today's social justice crusade is it is being prosecuted by the elites themselves, who would rather theatrically blame themselves for phantom bigotry than speak honestly about the real causes of ongoing racial inequality, family breakdown, and an underclass culture that mocks learning and the conformity to bourgeois values as acting white. Anti-racism has become the national religion, with the search for instances of racism to back up that religion becoming ever more desperate. Over the last year alone, sneakers, ladies' flats, and sweaters have been purged from the marketplace for their imaginary connection to racist symbols. Innocent schoolboys have been tarred as bigots by the national media. I'm referring to the Covington, Kentucky boys in Washington, D.C., and a robust traffic in hate crime hoaxes has thrived. In fact, this is among the least racist countries in the planet. For all our historical sins, they were real, egregious, and a grotesque betrayal of this nation's founding ideals that took us unbelievable amounts of time to see and overcome. At present, there is not a single mainstream institution that is not tying itself into knots, trying to hire and promote as many underrepresented minorities as possible. Conservative philanthropists and corporations spend billions each year on social uplift programs to close the achievement gap. Taxpayer dollars are as liberally distributed from government coffers. We so much take these efforts for granted that we don't even see them. They have no effect on the dominant narrative about white indifference and exploitation. We are in uncharted territory. How a civilization survives with so much contempt for itself is an open question. It is not wholly fanciful to see America's drug-addicted malaise and rising mortality rates as a consequence of the non-stop denunciation of the male and white patriarchy. White identity politics is the inevitable result of this non-stop attack, however much we may regret it. But it is a perfectly logical one as well. If every other group celebrates its racial identity, why shouldn't whites, if only as a matter of self-defense? The claim that every feature of our world rests on racial oppression, the thesis not just of social justice education, but of the entire Democratic presidential primary field, and of the New York Times High School Destined 1619 Project, undermines the moral legitimacy of our country. All accumulation of wealth is suspect. Every technological breakthrough and business success becomes nothing more than rank exploitation. Even Max Weber might not have foreseen where the politicization of education would land us. He certainly would have been astounded that the hard sciences are now worrying about microaggressions and heteronormativity. We are jeopardizing the creation of new knowledge. But the most important function of schooling is to pass on an inheritance, as the philosopher Michael Oakeshott explained, and that function is now all but obliterated. Serious humanistic learning has been decimated. When I speak at college campuses, I ask students what their majors are and what their favorite classes have been. The answers are profoundly depressing. A shallow stew of communications studies, marketing studies, psychology, presidential debate scoring masking as political science, and syllabi featuring comic books and the young adult literature of dysfunction. The focus of student attention is relentlessly presentist. Our cultural past, however, is full of wonderful mysteries. How, for example, did Western literature evolve from medieval romance to the realistic novel? The romance peopled by allegorical figures who roam classical landscapes, the novel showing acute attention to individual character and the details of everyday life. What did such a change mean for how human beings think of themselves in the world? The evolution of form, whether in literature, art, or music, is a great adventure story, whereby we trace the ever-changing reflection of human experience in the mirror of human imagination. The greatest sin of the social justice diversity crusade is to teach students to hate this cultural inheritance. Their own lives are impoverished thereby, but the social justice crusaders are stripping the future as well of everything that gives human life meaning, beauty, sublimity, and wit. The National Association of Scholars has always understood that. It remains a crucial voice for restoring civilization to its proper place in education. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for speaking so directly, for what's so extraordinary. I think for some of us who've lived through this, it seemed ludicrous when it was started. It's just laughable, and now it's succeeded, and that is really quite extraordinary to me. I hope people will pay some attention. On a more trivial matter, I noticed there's a little scandal at Harvard or a demonstration because some lady in racial and ethnic studies as not being tenured. And I remember when I was at Harvard, almost nobody who was an assistant professor was tenured. So this is probably normal.
Right.
On the other hand, maybe the demonstrators are correct that Harvard is less than enthusiastic about race and ethnic studies. What hypothesis do you think is the correct one?
Oh man, I could tell you, Harvard, like every other college, is desperate. They want to tenure as many faculty of color as possible. The idea that, as is voiced by this professor's followers, that she has to meet a higher standard is ridiculous. I'm sorry, it is. The bidding wars are extraordinary. And she must have really been very far from being even plausibly within the range, because otherwise I can guarantee you that President Bacow would have insisted on her tenuring right away. I mean, gender, it's the same thing. We see this. I mean, look at what we've been living through with Kamala Harris. The only allowable reason for her not succeeding is white supremacy. Never mind the fact that here in North Carolina, it's Biden is the one who's getting black support. But inevitably, if you're a female and something doesn't go your way, you inevitably play the gender card. How about maybe you just weren't qualified? And the same is true for race. It becomes an automatic shield. I've recently crunched the numbers on this Kamala Harris thing. So now we have 2 of the 15 remaining candidates in the field, no, 3, 2 are black. That's 13%. The nation's black population is 13%. So it's perfectly proportional. And yet we're all told that this is an instance of racism. It is the automatic reflexive explanation for everything. And nobody is willing to ever contemplate the fact that maybe you didn't get that promotion because you didn't deserve it. Yes.
So David, in his talk, used the word power around social justice warriors, something about the quest for power.
Yeah.
And you early on talked about the destruction of the culture. I think there's a linkage between the two, is there not? I mean, isn't this all about power for the sake of power? So you sever us from the Western heritage? And
well, I think it's about power, it's about jobs, but I think it's also ideological. I don't think it is just like another alternative explanation that Jonathan Hay puts out is all just over helicopter parenting and students that are simply not prepared to face any kind of setbacks. I think this is an ideological crusade. I think it's about hatred as much as power. I think, speaking again, let's just look at this from a gender perspective. There is a war on males going on in this country. I have written about the outrageous torpedoing of the career of the great Spanish tenor Plácido Domingo, who is now, his American career is over. The Met has cast him out. The LA Opera has cast him out for nothing. And yet the celebration that broke out over the grave of his career by feminists across the country. This is a man who has given so much to classical music and to Western civilization, both through his extraordinary artistry and his entrepreneurship in creating vital institutions to keep opera and classical music going, is just an extraordinary creation and gift to humanity. And yet, his downfall at age 78, as if he poses a threat to a second violist in the pit orchestra of the Met, who feels threatened that Plácido Domingo is singing Macbeth on stage. It's ludicrous. And this can only be explained as a function of hatred against a civilization deemed too male and, yes, too white. Yes.
So thank you for your remarks. This might be beyond your ken, but I do not see a war on excellence in athletics. I don't see people begrudging Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, and I wonder if you could comment on that, because whatever is going on there in professional athletics could it be emulated elsewhere? That's the first thing. The second thing, with respect to young people, I'm sure you're aware of Jordan Peterson and the millions of disciples he has from largely online lectures. Isn't that a note of hope, that there is a hunger that is being satisfied outside the institution? And would that maybe be the future?
Yes, I completely agree. And that's this man is hoping for signs of optimism. I would not agree with the, you raised the Michael Barone dichotomy that was presented by a book of the great Washington political pundit Michael Barone about a decade ago, in which he posited this distinction between hard America and soft America. And he said these graduates of the epitome of soft America, which is these ridiculous universities, once they get into hard America, boy, is their spine going to have to stiffen up and they're going to have to show real skills. Well, as David suggested, the HR departments of hard America are now colonized by the graduates of soft America, who are bringing the diversity obsession with them. So that didn't work. Hard America is capitulating. I mean, look at what happened in North Carolina with your bathroom bill here. Corporations are absolutely cowards. But I totally agree. The online following of people like Jordan Peterson, of Ben Shapiro, and even, believe it or not, you read the newspaper comments sections online of everything other than the Washington Post or the New York Times. And again, it's like, where are you people when we need you? They're just incredibly sort of commonsensical. They're not buying the BS. So I, like David, do not purport to be a master of political organizing. That's for the activists and the non-social justice activists in the field who understand how to get movements going. I would say that is definitely a demographic to tap into. And if somebody could organize that, we would be going someplace. As far as sports, yes, it's amazing. I mean, I've often said, unlike the military, and our idea that we should have gender-integrated combat units, there will never be a female in the NFL, because America understands that sports, unlike war, is important. But whether that can be used to work in the other direction, no, of course not. I mean, this has been going, we've had this bifurcation now going on for decades, and people always, this is a meme that does get raised, well, why don't we care about bean counting on a football team or a basketball team? And we know from psychology, cognitive dissonance is something that people can handle quite easily, and somehow it's just seen as different. And with regards to sports, it is a weird thing. But I would say that the sports industrial complex, sometimes I think I've been obsessed with the hateful, hate-filled attack on the humanities, which is the thing that is deepest to my soul, along with classical music, for years. But sometimes I think I'm missing the boat entirely, that the reality of college is the sports industrial complex. And it is the sports teams, it is the coaches that drive the university, and the damn alumni who give money when their football team is winning. My view is, don't give money when it's winning or when it's not winning. Don't give money. But certainly, if you're going to give money, it shouldn't be because your football team is winning. That's not what college is about. Yes?
I see the germination of this in LBJ's Great Society. Am I correct? I mean, much of modern society evolution to this point, that's the causation.
Could be, because certainly that was the idea that government programs can substitute for mothers and fathers, that we stopped talking about personal responsibility, and the bourgeois norms that were widely shared at that point, the heroism of segregated black communities that had people that were absolutely committed to self-advancement, to education, to professional organizations, the heroism of the civil rights leaders, and their frank admiration for the greatest works of Western civilization, whether it was Du Bois expressing his affinity with Shakespeare and Dumas and Balzac, or Frederick Douglass talking about picking up a collection of 18th century British oratory from the likes of Pitt and Sheridan as a 12-year-old that gave birth to thoughts that he didn't even know he possessed. That was a high point, and the 60s, it did certainly change things. I would also say what happened in the 60s was the absolute fluorescence of the youth culture that began in the 1950s, thanks to America's extraordinary prosperity, thanks to the extraordinary success of capitalism that gave, for the first time in human history, adolescents spending power on their own. So of course, it's their father's credit card, but this created, it severed the dependency of young children on their parents and made them a target of corporations, and we got the entire veneration of youth culture that we've never recovered from. Except for our octogenarian politicians, I have to say. That's sort of a one remaining leftover of Confucianism, which I highly approve of. So, yes.
My cell phone works, my car works, the water comes out of the tap. Essentially everything that's involved with industrial kinds of things works pretty well. Mm-hmm. I've been studying papers that come out of universities. About 80-90% of even the science papers cannot be replicated. So there's this huge dichotomy between, I worked in a science company, and I told the HR person, I said, I'm not going to take the son or daughter of an employee unless they know math and chemistry. Mm-hmm. And she said, we understand each other. So that can happen, and I hope it's happening in industry, but I'm appalled at what's going on in the universities.
Well, you know, I don't know if you followed the firing of James Damore from Google in August of 2017. James Damore was a young computer scientist, engineer, total geek, very, shy and retiring. And he had the temerity and, frankly, the naivete to write a fact-based 10-page memo suggesting that the lack of 50-50 gender equality at Google and other tech firms, which is the obsession of Silicon Valley. Why don't we have 50% female engineers and computer engineers? May not be due to Google's rampant sexism, but instead to, as he posited, average career preferences among males and females. I'm not talking about any of your daughters who may be the next Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. I'm talking about average distributions. And on average, as psychology has known for decades with its big 5 personality traits, males gravitate towards more abstract work, ideas-centered, females towards more hands-on, people-centered work. Males have higher predilections for risk-taking, for competition. And so Damore said, well, maybe, we're doing all this diversity training. Maybe there's some other explanation. He got fired for that. And the language that Google's CEO, who's now been elevated to the head of Alphabet, I see, Sundar Pichai, by the withdrawal of Sergey Brin and his colleague Page, the language that Google's CEO used in firing James Damore echoed to a letter the pathetic language of academic victimology. He said that Damore's memo made Google's female employees feel unsafe at work. Google is now being sued, and YouTube is being sued by a HR employee who was fired because he refused to go along with YouTube's mandate to interview only females and so-called people of color for engineering jobs. In other words, if you were white, Asian male, you could not get interviewed for engineering. So the big firms are walking away from talent. They would rather have a diverse workforce than to get the very best. And so I've often said that if Trump really wants to close and make sure that China stays in its place, the best thing he could do is dump a couple cargo holds of gender theorists from American universities onto Beijing and its research labs. Because as long as our gender theories departments keep cranking them out, it is happening in the big firms. Now, the smaller firms, if they can avoid some of this, but when they grow, it'll happen.
I have to make one comment. A Chinese guy, rich guy, gave $350 million to the Harvard School of Public Health. If you want to know any department that can screw up an economy better
Harvard
than anything, it's the
Public Health.
Harvard School of
Absolutely.
Public Health. And so this may be happening, that they're screwing us up. And we need to send some of our...
Counter-espionage, that's a great
Yeah.
idea. Right.
I thought we were talking about sports.
I think we've got to go to other
I'm
people.
sorry.
Yeah,
I was-
thanks.
Well, so actually, I wanted to ask sort of about about that. So, it seems to me, I don't know if you know of examples of other cultures or civilizations that have this problem, this sort of deep-seated, the way you put it, hatred, this attitude on the part of students. So I guess, why not? And where does that stem from in Western culture? That's a big question, I guess. But
I really don't. Again, Chinese Cultural Revolution, they turned on themselves. They said our Confucian tradition, our exam-based system, it's all has to be torn down. Other than that, we see even now the inclination of most nations historically throughout time has been to whitewash their past. It's still going on. I mean, Japan still has a pretty nationalist history, I think, and maybe that's a fault. And arguably, yes, I'm sure for the first half of the 20th century, American history books were incredibly shallow and unfactual about the degree of racial oppression in this country. But we are so far from that being an ongoing problem, it's ridiculous. And I again, the self-flagellation that goes on, it's completely remarkable. I mean, I marvel with contempt at these college presidents like Yale's Peter Salovey, who would rather accuse his own institution, meaning his own faculty, of racism than tell the truth about why there isn't proportional representation in X, Y, and Z department or graduate school. It's extraordinarily strange. And I think part of it, when somebody like a Peter Salovey at Yale does that, there's a degree of noblesse oblige and of virtue signaling, because what they're really saying is, yeah, I mean, Yale may be kind of racist, but the real racists are the ones out there in red state America wearing the MAGA hats. And it's a way of displaying, feeling like they are the ones standing between oppressed minorities in this country and the Ku Klux Klan wannabes. But it's I think, again, I don't have empirical evidence for it, but there is a malaise in this country, and as trivial a problem when it comes to gun homicide deaths as these mass shootings are, and believe me, they are way exaggerated by the media. Why? Because they actually have white victims. As I say, the media doesn't give a damn about black lives. It doesn't give a damn about them. I have been writing about the toll that crime takes on good law-abiding inner city residents, and the media doesn't give a damn unless they're shot by a police officer. But this problem, we keep turning our eyes away from it, and I don't know what's going to get us out of it. Yeah, thank you.
I have a comment on that actually real quick. I have an interesting viewpoint. I'm kind of like in the middle. I think there's some very young people and some people over 60 or 60ish around there, some 40ish. I'm from New Jersey. I relocated to Charlotte. Charlotte is like a gun capital now in the world. I'm New Jersey and relocated. I never owned a gun in my life. The black on black crime there is astounding.
Yeah.
In and around North Charlotte, and I live just outside of that.
Right.
I recently attended a, this is just kind of like a thing, I recently attended a microaggression lecture, and this is the only one I ever went to in my life at UNC Charlotte, one of the places that you had mentioned, the Office of Identity and Gender. That session I went to just to see what was going on, I was astounded at what I heard. It's the first time I ever went to anything like this in my life ever. I questioned the speaker, a woman who was from West Coast, I think Portland area, Dr. Obier or something like that, big time liberal radicalist to me. It just was really astounding to hear that kind of the level of vitriol that was coming in, and how many people were in that room.
Right.
It was a lot. It was unbelievable lot. So anyway, that's just kind of a thing I went through, and just now kind of like starting to go to these esteemed people and hear people. I want to thank you first for like taking slings and arrows, going around the country and speaking like this, because I think it's really important to actually have another viewpoint that kind of pushes back a little bit and wants to instill some personal sanity into the conversation. As somebody that goes around the country, how often do you get protested, and what's the most extreme stuff have you been through? Because I think that's kind of a thing that's really now is like shutting down people from actually having their voices heard. Like, what's the most extreme stuff you've gone through personally at where you spoke before? Obviously today is kind of a mild thing, but I would think. There's no way throwing anything. Like, what's the worst extreme case you've been through?
I just realized I hadn't finished my thought about the mass shootings. I do think that some of this is driven by this hatred that is being directed at this subpopulation, and well, I discuss it in my book, so get the book out there, Diversity Delusion. I guess the most extreme was at Claremont McKenna, where the students, about 300 of them, blockaded the auditorium where I was supposed to speak so that nobody could get in. So they eventually, in essence, shut that one down through the implicit violence. But just this last month, as Jennifer wrote about in the College Fix, and as I wrote about in the Wall Street Journal, I got some more, these were more amusing protests at Holy Cross 15 minutes into my talk, when I was actually, at that moment, talking about that great white supremacist François Rabelais, the 16th century great French novelist, and his great novel Gargantua, and talking about the hunger of the Renaissance humanists for classical learning, something that I was saying all students should emulate. That it's, if you want difference, if you want diversity, try the past. Try the classical past. That's some real diversity. It's not studying your damn gonads. So, as I was discussing Rabelais, a pre-organized protest all got up. They'd hoped to fill the entire auditorium so that nobody else would be able to come, and they all got up and started chanting, "My oppression is not a delusion." This is at Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Your oppression is a delusion.
Have you ever spoke outside of the United States? Canada, anywhere else?
Yeah. This summer I was at the French Senate, but yeah.
Okay.
You touched a little bit on this, and I'd like you to expand for us. You said that eventually there will have to be some sort of white identity organization.
No, I said it's inevitable. I say it's a matter of logic, and it's an inevitable human instinct.
What would it look like? What kind of because the instant anybody begins to try to do this, the extremists, the real white supremacists, will try to grab hold of it, and then the whole idea that there could be a legitimate expression of white identity is dismissed. So in your view, what would an organization, in a context in which other ethnic groups are organized and demanding, what would a white organization legitimately look like?
Well, you know, this is very dangerous, touchy territory. And again, my point, just to be very clear, was that this is an inevitability. I am simply empirically describing what is happening and what is going to happen more. You cannot, the argument that is made by the left, which is that only whites can be racist, is not true. I have spent a lot of time in Harlem reporting on, again, the good people there who want the cops, who believe in public safety, who understand that you've got to get these gangbangers off the streets. And I've been told by the residents of the Johnson houses not to go next door to the Taft houses because they really hate white people there. I mean, you go pick up the literature of Al Sharpton's National Action Network, and you tell me whether blacks can't be racist. So there's not a single nation, civilization, culture, and history that is not racist towards the other. So I am merely saying that it is happening and it's going to happen. What I would say that we need is a identity movement that celebrates Western civilization and says that this is a civilization that, of course, like every other civilization, has committed injustices, has struggled for power, but it is the only civilization that gave humanity the principles to fight back against that injustice. It comes from nowhere else. All of these social justice crusaders, they are making their claims in the name of ideas of individual rights and dignity and fairness that came out of the West. So I would just say, I don't know, students should be down on their knees in gratitude for the privilege to study these works, and that faculty are not willing to explain that to them. They should all lose their tenure immediately and be sent out onto the streets.
On that cheery thought, Paul ended the Q&A because we want to sell some of your books.
Great, thank you.
We are about to have a break. Heather will sign some of those books if you want to buy them. We also have some snacks, food in the back.